I'd like to welcome you all to our presentation tonight. This presentation is part of the ARC of Northeastern Pennsylvania's parent advocacy training. So we have created a number of presentations the last few years on different topics related to special education and other types of services and supports for individuals with intellectual and developmental disability. So at the ARC of Northeastern Pennsylvania, we work with individuals from birth and their families through adulthood to provide support and advocacy in terms of special education, connecting people with resources, helping them plan for the future and transition to adulthood. So we have done some presentations for universities and other organizations as well. So tonight we're going to talk to you on the topic of behaviors, discipline, and bullying in special education. And these are areas that we as advocates get a lot of calls on at the ARC from folks that are having difficulties at school in these areas, and families get very concerned to understand their rights and the processes that are outlined to support children in these areas. So I'm going to just move along to the next slide here. If you guys have any questions, you can certainly enter them in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, or we could just save them to the end and I could turn the recording off to have any kind of discussion you might like to have. So the first area to look at is we're going to talk about the behaviors. So discussing addressing behaviors in the IEP. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware, an individualized education program is that support for students that have a qualifying disability and are in need of especially designed instruction, and that would be determined by the evaluation that takes place. So some things we're just kind of assuming the knowledge tonight, and we're just going to move right into these areas. So, but we always want to clarify that IEPs are not just for academics. Sometimes people are misconception that, they might not need an IEP because they have good grades, or that they are at grade level. But they're not just for academics. It's for students to receive also functional support for those functional needs to become independent and to be employed or to go to secondary education. So those IEPs can be for those functional needs as well as the academic needs. They can also be for social, emotional, or behavioral concerns and needs. So we also remember that the needs are what is like referenced in the IEP, not so much the diagnosis. So a diagnosis shouldn't really drive the IEP or the placement or what's needed. It's really those needs. So if a child is having behavioral concerns, we tell families to go ahead and request an evaluation, because if those behaviors are impeding their learning or the learning of others, then there are steps that need to be taken. And you want to request that evaluation in writing and request why and what type of behaviors you're seeing. Sometimes we'll also see the teacher is saying, they're recommending the child be evaluated because the behaviors of concern are impeding the learning or the learning of others. So it may come from the family or it may come from the parent. And if the parent requests it in writing, there's going to be some certain things that are going to have to take place. And they're going to really look at those behavior rating scales or some other tools that we'll get to on a further slide. If you already have an IEP and you want to bring now, you're just checking through the document to make sure the behaviors are addressed appropriately, and also in terms of the requirements for regulations, you would look at the special considerations page of the IEP, which is right at the beginning where there's listed like, is the child have deaf or hard of hearing, visually impacted, do they need assistive technology? And one of those boxes down at the bottom says, do the child have behaviors that impede their learning or the learning of others? And if that box is checked yes, then they should have a subsequent positive behavior support plan in this IEP. So if it's something new, then you're going to want to revise the IEP and check that box. Also, behavior can be addressed in the IEP under the present level section. So any known behaviors the child is having, any diagnosis that has behavioral attached to it, like any kind of interventions or supports that have historically worked, or any kind of triggers, then you're going to want to have like that information in the present levels because that's sort of driving the IEP, and you want to make sure that it's documented. Additionally, we recommend to parents to kind of do like a little snapshot or information about your child, and you might want to bring that up in that little 10 things to know about my child or snapshot of my child, so people know they're working with your child that or working with the student. You can easily see that this is something that may be a concern. They may get overstimulated, for example. Loud noises might bother them. They may have trouble focusing if there's, large group instruction going on, things like that. And then another section of the IEP is also important is if they have that need, they may also have a goal so you could track their progress. And you can have behavioral goals in the IEP and also in the positive behavior support plan of the IEP, but also in the general goal area. And they really need to be measurable and specific to the individual student. You really don't want to see things like will follow the school rules, because that's expected of every child, and that's not really honing in on the need of the student. And then the last section in the IEP, the regular sections of the IEP that you would see behavior addressed would be in the specially designed instruction, specially designed instruction and supports and services. And that would be a lot of different things could be in that area, and they should be as specific as possible. And that's where all staff should really be aware if there's any accommodations, modifications, and supports that the student requires, and make sure that all the staff and students are aware. And there's other sections where it maybe could apply in like the transition section, for example, or in related services, but these are the ones where we're really focusing in to make sure that behavior is addressed in that area. So now we're going to talk about just briefly, some interventions and resources that may assist with identifying and addressing behavioral concerns. First thing is you could call an IEP meeting, assuming they already have an IEP. So like I said before, if they didn't have IEP and you want to bring the concerns to the parent and have a meeting and to get the ball rolling as a possible need. But if they already have an IEP, you're going to call a meeting for any new behaviors or concerns that you're seeing, to really make sure there's a plan in place and we're communicating with the family and all the staff involved, and we could start tracking and figuring out what's causing this behavior. If it's a new behavior, or if it's something that's a new student that just came into the school, we're going to want to work on identifying and trying to address and fix these issues. If we're going to go in the IEP meeting, we may have to adjust some of the SDIs, but we want to be very specific as much as we can and possible what we're going to implement, and make sure that all the staff working with the student is aware of the changes we made. So if we're going to be moving their seat to a different section of the classroom and we're going to put that in the SDIs, we want to make sure all the classroom teachers that work, they know that that was something that we've added into the IEP to try. A behavior improvement plan, sometimes we're not ready to get right necessarily into a functional behavior assessment or a positive behavior support plan, but we just want to do an informal plan just to start out and trial and error a few things. It really needs to focus on how staff and behavior can be changed for that individual student. We want it to be a combination of, what we need to do to support the student so their behavior changes, not just putting it strictly on the student you need to stop doing this, or this can't keep happening. We want to really focus on those school interventions that could be helpful in those related services. So, it could be simple as schools intervention, such as just like having a buddy that kind of models appropriate behavior. Maybe you're going to have a social skills group where you're going to get like 2 or 3 kids together and they're going to work on developing some of these social skills where they're not like jumping out of their seat or they're not interrupting and they're raising their hand. But maybe we do need the level of that we are going to have to like maybe bring in a personal care assistant to kind of help or a instructional aid that's going to kind of work with the student one-on-one. But sometimes we get to the point where we have to change more concrete things and add in some of those services, such as meeting with the social worker, talking to the guidance counselor, and involving like a curriculum or a program. And sometimes they're doing some of these programs school-wide. And then sometimes we're going to talk to the family about, is there any outside services that they've obtained, or do they have an outside diagnosis? Can we get them intensive behavioral health services through their insurance? And kind of help guide them because sometimes the families are now you're seeing the behaviors at school and they're also seeing them at home. So there's a number of different interventions and resources from minimal to maximum that you can take. So if we do need that FBA, that functional behavior assessment, IDEA says that, and that's the federal law. And then we do have our Chapter 14 in Pennsylvania for special education. They do say that behaviors impeding, like I mentioned before, the learning of that student or the learning of others, they need to have a functional behavior assessment done. And that will be considered like an evaluation. So you may have to have paperwork that's done and the parents approve it and have a timeline to get it completed. Ideally, you'd like to have, some schools do have a board certified behavior analyst, or, there's a behavior specialist, or you might like use an outside agency. A lot of schools are contracting now with behavioral health agencies to do things in their school. So ideally, that would be great if we could use their expertise. But if not, it's really not required under the law. The teacher, the paraprofessional could collect data, the teacher, the school psychologist, any kind of educational consultant like on staff, they could be conducting the FBA. It should be really specific and represent all areas of the behavior that's been noted. And it should become then a part of the IEP. The functional behavior assessment has like 4 main objectives. And the first one, and I'm not a behavior specialist, and I don't, I'm not, this is just a brief overview just for understanding the process. That number 1 is that we have to clearly define what the problem behavior is the child's exhibiting in the classroom. So we want to be very descriptive. We don't want to just say, oh, the child's having aggressive behavior, because what aggressive behavior could be viewed differently to different staff or different people. So is the kid, punching people or is aggressive behavior like swatting at somebody? So we want to be very descriptive in the type of behavior we're looking at. And we want to use that measurable and objective language and really action oriented rather than based on assumptions of the child's feelings. So we don't want to assume anything. We want to be as concrete as possible. So for an example, an identified behavior could be that, and this is very kind of simplified, but the student places their head on the desk like all the time, laying down like this rather than doing the task. So, the student, we don't want to say like the student is being very defiant and they don't want to participate in the lesson. So that's not how we want to describe the behavior in those type of terms that are very emotional or very not like concrete. So we want to say exactly what the behavior is. And then this FBA is trying to determine the why. So that's another reason why it should be, we shouldn't be assuming things back at, the first level of the FBA. We want to utilize data that's collected to examine the behaviors. So we often see the ABC chart or ABC analysis with A standing for antecedent, B for behavior, and C for consequence. And that chart can really be used to track and see before the behavior, what happened. So that's the antecedent, what was happening before. What the behavior is then, like, detailing then, this is what happened first, then this behavior occurred. And then what happens after is considered the consequence, which never necessarily is, when you see consequence, people think like, oh, that's punishment or whatever, but it's just what happened after. And this really can help provide a framework and context to which the behaviors, and this will help you with the step 3 of the process, which the step 3 is really going to outline the hypothesis or the theory as to why the behavior occurs, which is really sometimes really difficult to figure out. But really, that's how we get to addressing the behaviors, by figuring out the why. So what is the function behind the interfering behavior? Why is the student doing that behavior? I hate to say it, but as an advocate and as a parent, I hate to see that it's only escape or attention, because that could, why attention for what? Escape from what? And there could be other deep down more issues that are causing the behavior. But a lot of times it has to do with communicating something. They're communicating and it's coming out in this behavior. So it's really important to have that observation, the teacher, and the parent feedback as part of this this process, these 4-step processes. So for example, we would say like an antecedent is the teacher said, all right, it's time to sit down and do our math. And then the student starts throwing the chairs and hides behind the desk. And then the consequences, the teacher maybe ignores whatever's going on with that student and keeps teaching the lesson. So that's just, again, like a top level, just an example, so you can kind of see antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And then after the functional behavior assessment is completed and we look at that data and we try to figure out why, then we have to create what's called the positive behavior support plan. In some other areas or other states, they might refer to it as a behavioral intervention plan, a BIP. But in Pennsylvania, we have the positive behavior support plan, and it is a whole section of the IEP. So that's where we really do that 4th piece of the 4 steps. And that step is to provide those strategies and the recommended actions to reduce or replace the interfering behavior. So it's going to detail, this is what happens, and this is what we do. And this is how we're going to measure and see if it's working. So this positive behavior support plan is necessary to monitor and track progress towards resolution of these interfering behaviors. And a lot of times you really need to work on this positive behavior plan, and you might have to adapt it here and there, but you want to make sure you're doing it with fidelity and you're doing it consistently and you're giving it a chance to work. And anybody that works in behavior will know that, like, you have to try things, and sometimes behaviors get worse before they get better. But once things are done consistently, it can help. So those goals really need to be the same as any goal in the IEP. It needs to be measurable, it needs to be specific, it needs to be attainable, it has to be relevant, and it has to have a time bound. It has to have a measurement. And we really want to note the frequency of the data being collected and the reporting procedures, because we don't want it to be just anecdotal, like, oh, teacher observed, or so-and-so observed. We want to make sure it's being tracked and shown, and coming up with a pattern and doing the same thing over and over again to see if it's effective. So we really want to teach the students strategies for managing their behaviors, learning to cope. But also some of the way that the staff may respond will also help. So we want to make it not just about the student, but also about what supports we can give the staff, what kind of training we can give them to address the behaviors and try to manage them and fix a few things. Because really working together and communicating with your IEP team, a lot of the times we get called in as an advocate is because the communication is breaking down. So if we can keep those lines of communication open and revisit and give things a chance to work, we may have a lot of success with managing behaviors in the classroom. And now we're going to talk about another big issue that we hear often at the ARC is families call and they have a lot of misconceptions about discipline, or they're calling us at the last hour because there's a major issue or their child got suspended, expelled, the police are involved, they're not allowed to return to school, they're getting an out-of-district placement, and there's a lot of things that can be prevented, and there's a lot of things that we have to clarify with families we work with. So we tell everybody from the beginning, it's very important for everyone to familiarize yourself with your school's code of conduct and your rules. You are signing off on those rules, and they still apply to people with IEPs and disabilities. So you really want to make sure that you're not just checking the box, signing the signature, and you don't understand the rules of the school. You want to discuss, families need to discuss with their IEP team any concerns they have with their child's ability to follow the rules, because things can be documented in the IEP and students can be working towards following the rules better or understanding what's expected of them and giving them support they need. So we can add things into the specially designed instruction We can add in parental concerns, some things that the parent might find their child's having a really difficult time following the rules, listening to the teachers, not getting in trouble, making, a lot of kids may make poor decisions at different times in their life or due to their disability. Um, and we want to make sure that's documented in those areas of the IEP. So the parental concerns, the present levels, and the SDIs. And any known behaviors going back, a lot of times behaviors are causing the discipline issue. So if we know those behaviors ahead of time, we can be working on addressing them. And we can know that they're a part of the IEP, because when it comes time for discipline issues, two of the criteria, one of them is the IEP being followed. Well, if there's not even addressed in the IEP, then how are we going to be able to address it and try to help the student and follow the IEP? So again, students with disabilities are not exempt from school code of conduct. All students are expected to follow them, and there should be teachable moments for people with disabilities or people that are younger and are learning to understand and consider when it comes to discipline. There is no exception. There are rules, and we're going to get into that, and it can be very confusing, and there's a whole like little right to special education in Pennsylvania for advocates. You guys probably can't see that because I have this presentation up here, but I'll share it with you guys at the end. And that's kind of our go-to Bible we use, because it details all about discipline, manifestation of disability, the rules of, under the state laws and that. And so we have to reference that quite often because it can get very confusing. But if you'll just remember a few points, is that there's illegal drugs, and it's getting a little bit trickier now with medicinal marijuana and stuff like that. But it's still illegal drugs, weapons, or serious bodily injury. You're going to get suspended. There's not going to be an exception to some of those things, or you're going to get expelled, and they could change your placement. And there's what's called a manifestation of disability, and there's like a federal like IDA regulation on that, and it kind of details the steps and what manifestation of disability means in terms of behavior and discipline. So I'll explain some of that now, and but again, I can give you some of the resources that detail it much more specifically. But we have to remember with manifestation of disability is a this behavior or this discipline issue has a direct relationship to the child's disability. So they're going to be looking at, do they have impaired judgment or reasoning? Do they know their behavior was wrong? Do they have such a severe emotional disturbance that they can't figure that out? Are they having depression, suicidal thoughts? Do they have a neurological or medical condition? Do they have an uncontrollable behavior, maybe like Tourette's, like where they don't have any control over possibly what they're saying or movements? And also, they're going to look back at, has the child historically had controlled behavior and it just like came out of nowhere? They normally don't have this type of thing, or do they have a history of this? And is the child escalated in such an emotional state that the disability and all that is impacting them and that could really happen. I mean, fight or flight, or shut down, or any of that. That's legitimate things that do happen. So that is one area that's going to be concerned when they're going to be asking those type of questions when trying to figure out if it's a manifestation of disability. The second piece of that is, like I mentioned, is the suspension due to discipline a direct result of the LEA, the school, the local education agency, to implement or follow the IEP? So if it has this wonderful FBA and positive behavior plan with all these steps in it, or a crisis plan, and nobody followed it, well, then really it's back on. It really isn't the student's fault, because everyone should have known and should have been trying these strategies. So but if it's no to both of these questions, then guess what? You're getting expelled or you're getting sent, and it's fine, because it didn't happen because of your disability. Parents, then you might have to find your own placement, or you might have to could be expelled, and the school, the school will notify you if they have an alternative placement for you, or they're going to put you on homebound. And sometimes students could be sent to what's called an alternative educational place for disruptive youth, AEDI, and a lot of AEDY, but a lot of them are filling up. So it's difficult when these major situations happen. But the school can then suspend you even without for those serious injury, so serious issues like weapons, drugs, and the serious bodily injury of somebody. And they could do that for 45 days. So that's a big change, and that's a major thing that people have to be aware of. And also, please take note if the child doesn't have an IEP yet, but they're going through the evaluation process, or they're suspected or thought to be that they have this disability that's impacting them, then those rights still apply for this manifestation process. So getting into a little more detail of the manifestation of disability, because it is a lot and it's a lot to cover, but um, if the student gets in trouble and the proposed discipline then becomes a change of placement, so they're suspended for 10 days for any student with an IEP. But if you have intellectual disability and you get suspended for 1 day, that's considered a change in placement. So just remember that change of placement, 10 days for other students, and students with ID is 1 day. So if there's that change in placement, that triggers the manifestation determination meeting. So when that school must, when this happens, the school has to examine if the student has extra protections due to this infraction being a result of their disability by holding that manifestation determination meeting and discussing the things we talked about on the previous slide. So I'll just give you, again, a basic example. A student has autism classification, and they also have intellectual disability. So remember that. They have known behaviors. So these are documented well in the IEP that include yelling, fleeing, like eloping, throwing items, hitting. So there are some of the behaviors the student might have, and their known triggers for this are loud noises, not knowing what to expect. So, if something happens suddenly without any warning, being rushed and forced to go in a hurried manner, and also being touched, like grabbed or touched, not that, or even like told, like, come on, we got to go. So in their IP and that specially designed instruction, they include such things as a visual schedule, so they know what's going to happen next. It has in there pre-planning. So if we know what's going to happen, we're going to tell the student as best we can. Again, you can't always know what's going to happen. They need increased processing time. So if you make a request, they need a couple extra seconds. They need noise canceling headphones because noises bother them. So they're supposed to be wearing them. They need instructions repeated multiple times. So taking in mind all those different things that are already in the IEP and that the student has intellectual disability and autism, one day the fire alarm goes off. And we can't always plan for that. So the fire alarm goes off and the student's headphones are nowhere to be found. So they do not have access to them. They weren't aware of the fire drill, which if we can find out, we can prepare the students. If not, and it's a real fire, then maybe they don't know. The student is hurried. Hurry up, we got to go. Instructed, quickly moving along. The student gets very upset, starts like throwing the desk. They're hitting at the teacher. And then principal comes in later and says, okay, student is suspended. They need to go home. We can't get their behavior under control. So they're sent home suspended for the day. So, then what happens? Well, because the student has intellectual disability, 1 day suspension results in a manifestation determination meeting. If the student didn't have intellectual disability, then it would be counted as 1 day suspension. And then if they came back the next day and they didn't get sent home, then we wouldn't be having this meeting. But since it's a student with intellectual disability, you'll have to have that manifestation determination meeting. And what they will discuss at that meeting is, one, is the behavior the result of the disability, which we have that very much documented. Is the behavior the result of the IEP not being properly implemented? Yes, some of it, the stuff that was being rushed along or being prepped ahead of time, which sometimes we can't do all that, but maybe there was a few things that weren't followed. Is the behavior the result of the positive behavior plan? So if the student has those known behaviors, they should have that positive behavior support plan saying what to do if the child has these behaviors. So if there's a fire drill and the child gets upset, this is what we're going to do, move the other children out first. We're going to have somebody dedicated to him. We're going to have his, a sensory bag ready to go in case there's a change like that. So all the things that were in the positive behavior support plan, were they followed as well? Or just make sure there even is a positive behavior support plan. So then we need to have that meeting. We definitely have to have the meeting and discuss those things. And make a plan for adjusting and addressing the behaviors. So how would we do that? We would maybe conduct a new FBA, adjust the positive behavior support plan, make a new plan, review what was in there, what we should have done, because we want to support the child and the staff and the students as best as possible. So just to remember and to recap is just one day for a student with ID, you need to have this manifestation meeting. Every other student will be 10 consecutive days or 15 cumulative. So if say they're suspended once a week, like for 3 or 4 months, well, guess what? After those 15 days of suspension, or a pattern like 11 to 15, or like we have there's like maybe 8 in a row, and then they're back for a little while, and then they have like 3 more lumped together, then you're going to have that manifestation determination meeting. And this is where that no information like handouts on manifestation really do come in handy. Expulsion, before we move on to this positive placement changes, expulsion, 10 or more suspensions, could become permanent. So, sometimes a lawyer does need to be involved to talk to the students about their rights during this process to avoid expulsion on a school record, making sure that disability manifestation is covered, and that we're talking about helping the child to move forward. Expulsion, it can be very dangerous for families. It follows the student and can prevent them maybe from getting into trade or college or military or something like that, due to making a mistake. Like, because sometimes things can be on accident. I did have a case where I had to send somebody over because the kid lived out in the rural area with disabilities, and he carried a pocket knife and he carried it to school, and there's zero tolerance for that. And it really was an oversight. So some of those things, it's really important to talk to families, to talk to their children, and make sure they understand the severity of some of these things. So now we'll just talk about some placement changes due to behavior. So again, a placement change would be very restrictive and probably hopefully be the last thing that you need to do, but sometimes it is necessary. So placement changes due to behaviors after 10 days of suspension, or that change in placement of one day, that's considered a change in placement. So if you're sent home one day with intellectual disability, that's suspended. If you're suspended 10 days, that's a change in placement for everybody else. So, least restrictive environment still applies. Students should always be in their least restrictive environment with all supports and services. Placements need to be appropriate for the individual student. So, example, you don't want to send a student with emotional needs. You don't want to send a student to a program that doesn't fit their needs. If their emotional needs is this placement is for students that have emotional distress or needs, and this student doesn't have it, you're not going to want to send them there if it's not appropriate, because that probably isn't going to help them, and it could make things worse. So not just take whatever placement's available. Here are some possibilities for more restrictive placements, and really would depend on the student and their needs and talking to the IEP team. So sometimes an abbreviated day. So sometimes we see this sometimes with like kids transitioning from early intervention, or lately children that never have been in school at all, and they go right into all-day kindergarten, may be really difficult for them. We don't agree that this is the right thing to do all the time, but sometimes families or schools discuss this, and they have a plan to maybe they only go to school half the day, or they go back to their ABA program the other half. But we always want to remember that any of these changes in placements require the NORUP, and they should have an end date. It shouldn't just be, the abbreviated day, and we're just arbitrarily deciding that with no end in sight. We need to increase back to the full days, back to their free and appropriate public education. Homebound or instruction in the home. Sometimes these get interchanged, but they're really not the same thing. They're very different. Homebound is not a special education placement. That's a medical determination. It's supposed to be temporary, supposed to be a short time span due to a medical reason, like usually probably 3 months at the max. I mean, sometimes people were a little bit longer. But instruction in the home is a very restrictive placement, and that's an IEP team decision because the student cannot attend school in the building, and they also get the related services, and it can last the whole length of the IEP. We see some kids that are really getting instruction in the home for a long time because they don't have a nurse to attend school with them, and we just want to make sure that the schools are doing the due diligence to try to help the families get these nurses so the kid can be in the school building where they should be. Partial hospitalization residential treatment facilities are also part of the mental health services outside of school. So that would be like a team decision. We're working with the medical assistance provider and a whole team, maybe a CAS meeting where it would be all different supports would be working together to get the student the educational time and the hospitalization or that rehabilitation and that therapy that they need. But those schools are approved private placements, and they're really dependent on special circumstances and making sure that the student, that's actually what they need and it's approved. And many of them also have waiting lists. And then, like I said, those alternative educational placements for disruptive youth, they're an option. Also, many schools are now moving towards like virtual or cyber placement when there's a behavior or a discipline issue or their students having anxiety, which is not necessarily the answer to many. It really has to be thoughtful if that really would work. We don't want to just push people into cyber because they're difficult in the building. And anything, again, would have to have that NOREP, Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, to change that placement. And the parents have the option to disagree or work on these with the team. I just also like to touch on indisciplined law enforcement because, we do get calls where people have been arrested or they get a citation and they're completely confused by it. But it's important to know that the law of Pennsylvania trumps school rules. So school discipline and legal charges aren't necessarily the same thing. If you break the law with, for example, you assault somebody or you steal something, you can be charged and you can also be disciplined from the school, and that would be two separate things. School resource officers, I just want to talk a little bit about them versus school security officers, because many schools have school resource officers that either work for the school or they work for the local police department. So school resource officers do have the authority to arrest and file charges. And some, like I said, work for the school and some work for the local police department. They have the same powers to arrest as any other police officer would. And they have the duty to respond as a police officer. So it's really important. I mean, we always encourage students in the school to treat and work with the law enforcement in their schools to have positive relationships and use that as an example of building trust with police. But they do have to remember that it's not different rules that apply. But a school security officer, they're usually managing the safety of the school. They patrol through the school. They make sure things are secure. They're not really the same as a SRO or a school police officer. They're not going to have like arresting powers in that. They're managing more of the safety and security of the school. And they shouldn't be called, like the police should not be responding like to the classroom on a regular basis. Like if there was a major catastrophe, of course, but they shouldn't be used as a threat or as a constant resource where it should be, the enforcing the school rules should be the job of the teachers and the administrators, the principal. Local police can still be called in to assist. And also, if you're expelled or you're charged with a crime, you're going to have to get an attorney. Like an advocate or someone else is not going to be able to resolve an actual crime. And you don't wait until you get that summons, as we tell folks, or charges in the mail, or find out the day before your hearing. Oh, I got to do something now. I have the hearing tomorrow. You really need to consult with those attorneys as soon as the incident happens. And lastly, tonight we're going to talk about bullying, which is really a difficult problem that we have in our many schools. And it really, just to start with, I'll define what's considered bullying. And it can take many forms, which is direct, which is like physically, pushing and assault, like touching and direct physical contact with somebody. Indirect, which could be like verbal, calling names or spreading rumors about somebody, intimidating them, like threatening them, that kind of stuff. And then it could take place in the schools, or also now with cyberbullying with texts, using apps, sending photos, making threats that way. And then also like to note another form of bullying is the bully victim. So that's like somebody that was bullied themselves, or they're currently being bullied, and then and yet they bully others. So that's a whole nother complex. And again, it's a very complex topic. I can't stress enough how important this area is, but it's not like we could do a whole presentation on this or bring in experts to talk about it, but just to make sure that you guys understand the severity of it. And bullying can rise to the level of harassment. And the difference between bullying and harassment is that that bullying behavior is directed at a target that is a protected class. So they're bullying somebody based on their protected class. And those protected classes are like race, color, religion, age, sex, disability, or national origin. So that could rise to the level of harassment, and people could be charged with that. So if you do happen to see bullying, or I say families are experiencing bullying, you need to report it right away, and you need to report it in writing. As we say in our advocacy department, that if you don't put it in writing, it didn't exist. So if you just call somebody and report, I think my child's being bullying, people are sending him inappropriate texts, and and you don't get the name of who you reported it to, and somebody's going to say, oh yeah, we'll look into that, and then they forgot about it, or they sent it to so and so, and then they forgot about it. So we really want to report it in writing, and send it to the teacher, send it to the principal, the director of special education, send it to your child, the case manager, and then ask for what the steps will be taken to escalate it. And if you, as a teacher, aren't sure what to do, every school has bullying policies, and you should also document it in writing. The school's obligation is to provide everyone with access to their education. And if the students are being bullied and they can't access their education, that's a really significant issue. And in Pennsylvania, we have over a dozen different anti-bullying regulations, and schools really are required to have very clearly defined bullying policies. So that should be posted with all their other policies, and they really need to take it serious, not brush it under the carpet. And at some schools, they might have staff training on bullying. They may have safety coordinators. They may have steps they can take, such as a school action plan to identify the issues, communication, how that will take place, how it's going to be monitored. All that stuff should be outlined in their plans. So when a parent calls in and they have a concern, they have the right to be notified. The steps are going to be taken. They need to be given a copy of the policies. And then any plans that are going to be made, they need to have a copy of what's going to be done. And then develop that plan to address the bullying situation, and adjust the plan as you go along, and offer those supports and services. So what can be some of those supports? So a student that has an IEP that maybe is dealing with the bullying situation, you may offer them things like social skills training, and how to you know, address their feelings or stick up for themselves, for example. You may have to assign temporarily an instructional aide or a personal care, or somebody that's going to keep an eye on things and make sure that the student is safe. You may have to have a counseling session, or something like that. And in the present, again, it all goes back to the present levels, the parental concerns, the SDIs, the goals. Something can be done in all these areas to address the concerns. Not so much that we're putting it onto the person that's being bullied to fix things, because it's not. It's actually helping them to cope with it better, and to figure out how that these concerns are being addressed, and how the child is being supported in these areas. And steps for additional resolution can take place. This is the number I put up here for the bullying consult line to report it. And you can look at civil rights violations, Office of Civil Rights, and other legal avenues. And you can look at Education Law Center is a really good resource. If you just Google them, they have a lot of good one-pagers on. They have a nice document on bullying. It explains, and I've sent that to a lot of folks that called in with bullying situations, the steps to take. They also have lots of other documents on different areas of the IEP that are useful. But that's like a synopsis of bullying. And I think that brings us to the end of our presentation on these three topics. I wanted to share with you our contact information at the ARC if you have a family or you have a question yourselves, and you can certainly reach out to us. and we'll try to help you or guide you. And we really work collaboratively with a lot of schools. Families are going to have long relationships with teachers and staff in their school district, so we want to try to address concerns in a positive manner as much as we possibly can. So I'm gonna stop the recording now. If anybody had any questions, I can also check the chat. But thank you very much. I hope you learned a little bit of something tonight. So let me see. Is that
Thank you so much for coming and speaking. I really appreciate it.